Good morning or good afternoon. This is Fletcher Harper with Green Faith, and I'm so sorry not to be able to be with you in person for your event on fossil fuel divestment. I appreciate the invitation, and I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes about why divestment is so clearly the right step for religious investors to take. A little bit of background: Green Faith, the interfaith environmental organization that I direct, does a range of education and training and campaigning and local organizing on a multi-faith level internationally with faith groups. And we've been involved in the fossil fuel divestment movement for about the past 6 years, since soon after its start by students in 2012, 2013. And I'd like to say that faith groups for years and years and years have been seeking to align their investments with their moral values. You saw back in the 1970s and 1980s faith groups advocating for action in apartheid South Africa, and it was religious groups that led divestment movements around that played a meaningful role in toppling the apartheid regime. You've seen faith groups for many, many years divesting from the so-called sin stocks, tobacco and alcohol, and some with firearms, some with weapons manufacturers. So there's a very, very long history within religious and spiritual communities about aligning capital investments, financial investments with moral values. So this broad topic is not a new one for faith groups. When it comes to the topic of actually making a divestment commitment, a divestment decision, faith groups usually use several factors in making that decision. The first thing that faith groups look at is the nature of the harm that's caused by the industry or actor in question, in this case, the fossil fuel industry. So when faith advocates looked at tobacco, for example, they saw a product that was causing very, very clear and verifiable health harm on a very wide scale. And that was something that was unacceptable to them or clearly wrong. When faith investors looked at the apartheid regime in South Africa, again, what they saw was a level of harm, a level of wrongdoing that was really, really, really bad. So that's the first thing that that faith groups look at is there a level of harm that's involved in the offending industry? And it's important, to be very realistic and not naive in terms of this assessment of harm. I mean, the level of harm for divestment to stick within faith groups traditionally has needed to be quite substantial. There's a recognition, I think, among faith investors that the world is not a perfect place and that there are, problems that come up in the conducting of business on a regular basis, and that's something that faith investors need to be mindful of. Divestment is not a first option. It comes after efforts to engage with the companies in question. It comes after efforts to advocate for them to change their practices or their policies that are at stake. And it comes when there's a very clear, sustained negative impact that the industry is not making changes of, is refusing to make changes on. So if the size of the impact is the first criteria, a second criteria is the one that I've just mentioned, which is the industry in question resistant to change? Is it, after being engaged seriously and thoughtfully, is it just very simply refusing to change its normal standard operating procedures? Is it refusing to be a responsible corporate citizen in that regard? And again, the tobacco industry and the divestment, the anti-apartheid divestment movements are good examples where there was very clearly sustained and multifaceted pressure from several different fronts to try to get the institutions in question to make changes, and they simply were unwilling to do so. So you take these two factors, the, the magnitude of the harm and the resistance to change, and if those two factors are in play over an extended period of time, that creates the circumstances in which serious religious investors have then begun to consider and to move towards divesting from that sector. So let's take a look and apply that to the fossil fuel industry. In terms of the level of harm, we've come to understand more and more that climate change poses for literally billions of people either an existential or a close to existential threat. Climate change threatens a level of harm to the human family, to human communities, particularly the most vulnerable, and to ecosystems around the world. A level of harm that we have not seen previously in the era of human civilization. And so the question of the level of harm is I think, answered pretty adequately and pretty clearly. I was listening just the other day, or reading just the other day, the results of a study that said that the continued and far more frequent levels of flooding in the Midwestern United States have even started to change the opinions about climate change of a number of people in that region of the US, people who tend to be more culturally conservative, people who tend to be more prone to skepticism about climate change, but they're feeling the weight of these changes come in the form of repeated flooding or threats of flooding of their very homes and their farms and their property. It's just one instance among many of the level of harm that we're going to be seeing on a consistent basis. So from Green Faith's perspective, the question of the level of harm is answered without question and without qualification. In terms of the long-term behavior of the fossil fuel industry, I'm afraid to say that the question is also answered very conclusively. The fossil fuel industry, just to share a number of sort of facts, is showing really no serious commitment to changing the way in which it operates or changing its core business models. Some people lift up Royal Dutch Shell as an example, but even they are failing the test on a meaningful scale. So what are some examples that lift this up? So first is that the fossil fuel industry spends more than $400,000 per day lobbying the US Congress. And they're not lobbying the US Congress to pass a carbon tax or to put a price on carbon. They may say that they have that as a formal position, but they invest no lobbying resources to try to prioritize that. So that's one piece, is you've got a clear, major continued effort to try to influence government. Around the world, the fossil fuel industry receives more than $1 billion, with a B, dollars per day in government subsidies on a global scale, and continues to spend more than $1 billion, again with a B, dollars per day, searching for new sources of fossil fuel reserves. This is, alarming in the context that we're in now, to understand that these companies are still out developing new oil fields, new gas fields. They're not scaling back those operations. And in fact, a recent research report showed that since the Paris Climate Agreement, banks globally have actually increased their financing to major fossil fuel companies for the development of new fossil fuel infrastructure. And so we've got this dystopian, ridiculous situation in which these companies all pledged that they were committed to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. But in actuality, what they've done has been to increase the level of their investment in new fossil fuel infrastructure, new oil and gas infrastructure, since the Paris Agreement was signed. So you take these examples, and then the complicated thing on an emotional level is that at the same point in time, another recent study by a really super UK-based group called Influence Map showed that these companies are now spending about $200 million per year on very slick advertising campaigns seeking to depict themselves as green energy or clean energy companies. So Exxon has ads running about biofuels, and Shell and others have ads about solar fields that they're promoting. And you look at the advertising that these companies do, and they're framing themselves as clean energy leaders, when in fact they're not. None of them have business plans that are compliant with the 2-degree goal of the Paris Climate Agreement, and so they're undertaking, sadly, a very, very cynical and ultimately blatantly dishonest advertising campaign to depict themselves to the public in a certain way while acting in a very, very different kind of way. And given what's at stake with the climate crisis, I don't think it's an overstatement to call that behavior sociopathic. And I know that that's a strong term, but I would ask you to defend how it's not that, in honesty. Some people can say, well, there are large industries. It takes a long time to turn the ship around. And I'm certainly willing to grant that. But for that argument to hold sway, there has to be an intention or an indication that the industry has an intention of turning itself around. And right now, what the indication is very clearly is that the industry plans to keep on doing the same thing to a very large degree, while undertaking a public relations exercise to try to make it seem otherwise. So again, back to the basic logic of the divestment piece. We've established that there's major harm, and we've established that the industry in question is not interested or willing to change, and that, to us, makes a very, very clear case for divesting. Now, there are some who say that the religious community has a long tradition of shareholder engagement, and that rather than divesting, we should keep our seat at the table and continue to advocate through the shareholder advocacy or shareholder engagement processes for these companies to change what they're doing. And our response to that is that is a practice that has been undertaken over the past 25 years. I respect and am friends with many skilled shareholder activists. They have, unfortunately, next to nothing to show for their effort in this area. There are a few corporate resolutions saying that certain companies will start to assess the impact of climate change on their core business model, but we're long past the point in time in which that's a meaningful response. And you still have some companies, ExxonMobil in particular, that are refusing even to take on that kind of exercise in any serious way. So our perspective is that the shareholder engagement approach to the fossil fuel industry is not a viable one. And I don't think that that's the fault of shareholder activists. It's one thing, for example, if Nike is trying to, if shareholder activists are trying to get Nike to change their labor conditions in their factories, that's a very different thing than from trying to get Nike to stop selling shoes. What we're trying to get the fossil fuel industry to do is to stop its core business. And at a challenge or a level of that kind of challenge, shareholder advocacy just very simply was not designed for that. And it's a mistake to think that it can deliver in that regard. On a very practical level, with these arguments in question, hundreds of religious institutions, largely Christian, though there are Muslim partners and Buddhist partners that we're aware of in the movement, have divested from fossil fuels. Within the religious sector, the World Council of Churches, the Church of Sweden, Union Theological Seminary, the United Church of Christ, the Unitarian Universalist Association, although that isn't really properly lumped into the Christian category, have divested hundreds of Catholic dioceses, archdioceses, relief and development agencies, parishes, Catholic universities have divested. The Islamic Society of North America has divested. The Church of England has taken an approach in which it just last year essentially said that it would give its shareholder engagement strategy 2 more years. And if the fossil fuel industry did not develop Paris Agreement compliant business plans, would move to divest. So you see that emerging as a transition for some religious institutions from shareholder engagement to divestment. Church groups in Australia, the United Church of Canada and Australia, it's a very bold and brave move by religious groups because the extractive industry and the fossil fuel industry is responsible for more than 30% of the economy of those countries. And so there's a very real, both economic and cultural challenge in terms of religious groups taking that kind of stand. You see faith groups across New Zealand, a growing number in South America, and overall around the world, there is now more than 1,000 institutions that have pledged divestment in some form from fossil fuels, and they have a total of more than $8 trillion with a T dollars of assets under management in total. That's not $8 trillion withdrawn from the fossil fuel industry, it's $8 trillion total that has been declared to be fossil fuel free in one form or another. This is the fastest growing divestment movement of any kind in history, and it is a fitting response to a challenge and a threat of absolutely titanic proportions. I'd like to spend a final couple of minutes talking about the importance not only of divestment from fossil fuels, but also of values-driven investors investing in a clean energy future, particularly for the 1 billion people around the planet who lack access to electricity, and the 2.6 billion who lack access to clean cooking facilities and who are saddled all of these households. And think of it, I mean, it's more than a quarter of the human family either lacks access to electricity outright or has extremely unhealthy, dirty cooking facilities that they're forced to rely on. And the result of this is that households without access to modern forms of energy suffer very, very serious health impacts. Indoor air pollution is a major one, and you see the World Health Organization noting that there are literally, I believe, more than 4 million deaths per year that are caused by this. You see these energy poor communities lack adequate education facilities and capacity. They don't have access to modern forms of healthcare because vaccines can't be stored and medications can't be stored in refrigeration. And there's no ability, or a very, very limited ability to create productive enterprise whereby businesses get started and employ people and have the ability to generate income that can lift communities from really crushing poverty to a better life. The energy access movement is one that really merits and deserves the attention of religious investors, because there are growing numbers of investment opportunities. It is the right way to invest in the energy sector from a values-driven perspective. And Green Faith is a co-founder of a campaign called Shine, and you can find out about it at the website. The URL is Shine, SHINE, invest, INVEST.org, shineinvest.org, which is designed, it's a collaboration of faith and philanthropic foundation and nonprofit or NGO investors working together to try to accelerate investment in a clean energy future, particularly for those people who lack access to modern forms of energy. The campaign is just getting started. There is under development a data tool to lift up for values-driven investors a range of different investment possibilities, because one of the things that people have told us is they're willing to look at these types of investments, but they need help seeing where they are and identifying where they are. So we're undertaking that research to make that data available. And we also think that that's just, really as institutions think about if they're going to be investing their resources in the energy sector, it shouldn't be in the fossil fuel sector. It should be in the clean energy sector, particularly with a focus on energy poverty. That's not to say that it's as simple as you take money out of one, sort of set of fossil fuel investments and just directly invest the same amount of money into renewable energy for energy poverty reasons. It's not a one-to-one correlation because they're slightly different types of investments, but nonetheless, it's something that we think that religious and spiritual groups that have investments around the world should be looking at. So in conclusion, again, I'd like to say that the harm that the fossil fuel industry is causing is absolutely massive and just simply must be stopped. That it is no longer morally right for religious institutions to profit from the operation of that industry. Very well-intentioned, very skilled advocates, scientists, educators, other leaders have tried for decades, literally, to get that industry to change, and it is not changing. There is no credible evidence to say that it is changing or that at a large scale it intends to change. To the contrary, I didn't even mention earlier the long and proven history of public dishonesty that the fossil fuel industry has in relationship to seeding and supporting climate skeptics operations. And so based on that, we think that the decision is a very, very clear one. And to those who say, oh, well, if you just sell your fossil fuel industry stock, someone else will buy it, it doesn't really make any difference. I would ask you how comfortable you would feel making that argument in relationship to tobacco or in relationship to the slave trade. My feeling is that what the religious institution has always done has been to say, this is what is right for us based on our values, and to act accordingly. And it's been because of that willingness to align our actual behavior with our values that we have integrity and that we have the ability, thank God, to help shift the culture. So I would like to urge you, if you are a religious institution that wants to consider this further, to be in touch with us. I'd be very, very glad to speak with you. We have experience talking with numerous religious and spiritual institutions about these issues. Terry knows how to reach me. I'm at Fletcher@greenfaith.org. We believe that this is clearly the right thing to do, and there's no question that it's beyond the right time to take this kind of stand. So thank you again for the opportunity to be with you. I hope your discussion is good. I'm really sorry not to be able to be there to engage in some back and forth and some question and discussion, but I hope you have a good afternoon. Thank you and goodbye.